They've claimed that this budget is going to spur tons of investment into Canada. Based on what you've seen, is that accurate or is that complete spin?
We've just tried this. We just had 10 years of this, where even before the pandemic, the government was spending all-time highs, right? Like, the government is not the solution to our woes. The government has become the problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a day it has been in Ottawa and in Canada across the country. Mark Carney and François-Philippe Champagne and their Liberal cabinet just dropped a monster of a budget on November 4th. They waited more than 6 months after they probably should have tabled this. We are almost 3/4 of the way through the government fiscal year, and now they're actually going to tell us how they're spending our money, or rather how they have been already spending our money. And we mentioned before that somebody was inside of the budget lockup earlier today that we were hoping to talk to. We were glad that came to fruition. Here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Franco Terrazzano from the Canadian Taxpayer Federation. Franco, thanks for joining us tonight.
Hey, Ryan, the pleasure's all mine. I love these chats.
So I'm still going to be competing with you in terms of energy because which is impressive because you've been in this budget all day staring at numbers, staring at hundreds of pages of budget documents, and I know you're still going to out energy me, but that's just how it is. So but before we get into the budget itself, talk us through the budget lockup, because this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot and most Canadians don't even know what it is. We gave them a little bit of a overview earlier today, but what was it like from your perspective?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, budget day is kind of like my Super Bowl, right? It's definitely not like Christmas, because Christmas you get good stuff, right? And budget day you really just get massive amounts of debt and hidden carbon taxes. We'll get into that in a second. But so you're in this big room, this massive room. A whole bunch of people are there, and they take away your phone, or at least you're not allowed to use it. And you're just scouring through like hundreds of pages of budget documents. I think this year's budget's like 500 pages. So you're going through it immediately after the lockup is done. When the budget is tabled, you have to, at least if you're with the CTF like me, you got to do a bunch of interviews, conversations like this. So you're really trying to distill the information in a relatively, it's a long period of time, but it's also a short period of time to go through 500 pages to try to figure out what's going on, especially when the government is trying to muddy the waters, right? Trying to make things complex unnecessarily. So you're actually just, looking for a couple key numbers, trying to figure out what's going on, and then reading the government spin, seeing what they're saying, and trying to figure out, what you're going to tell people when you come on shows like this. So, it's kind of like Super Bowl, except I would say a lot more boring, a lot more numbers, and a lot more debt.
Now, just so Canadians know, how long is the budget lockup? Like, how long were you essentially locked in this room?
Yeah, so it can be different in different years. So this year it was actually relatively short for me. It was 3 hours long. So you kind of get in line around 12. You wait through line. You get through security. You're not actually allowed to look at the budget documents until about 1 o'clock, and then the budget was tabled at 4. So I essentially had 3 hours to try to go through 500 pages, try to figure out what is going on, and be able to talk about it reasonably with you.
Now, was it just yourself there, or was there anybody else joining you from the CTF?
No, just me. It was just me from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. You have, a whole, like literally hundreds of other people are in this room representing a whole bunch of different stakeholder groups, things of that nature. So there's like hundreds of people in this room. Now I've been in Ottawa now for like 4+ years. So I do know some people in the room. You're able to kind of bounce notes off each other, make sure, you're seeing the same thing that they are. But from the CTF, it was really just me. Now, fortunately, I have such a great team at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Like Ryan, your audience probably knows Chris Sims. Like, she's fantastic. We have a great investigative journalist, Jen, who's on the team as well. So after the lockup is over, it's really up to me to kind of get these numbers. But we also have a great team at the CTF that can kind of confirm things, make sure we're all seeing the same thing.
Okay. Well, thanks for that, because it does give Canadians a bit more background, and Canadians are, if our channel is any evidence, they are hungry to know how their government actually works. So I'm sure Canadians across the country appreciate that insight. Now, let's get into this. So, from what I understand, the main numbers that are rattling around in my brain are $141 billion in additional spending, almost an $80 billion deficit, and our debt servicing costs, or our interest payments on our debt, is now eclipsing that of the healthcare transfers. So those are the numbers that stuck out to me, and those are just jaw dropping, because
Yeah.
in the fall, the Liberals were so embarrassed to table a fall economic statement that showed a $62 billion deficit that they wouldn't even speak to it. They refused to talk about it. They just dropped it on the table and left. And then we heard these whispers throughout the House of Commons, on Parleview, on live broadcast, of 62 billion, 62 billion. Like, everyone was just in shock about that. And now we're 30% higher than that, and the Liberals are standing up and applauding that. So give us your sense of what's in the budget and what are Canadians to think.
Ryan, you actually picked out the numbers that you picked out are actually, I think, really the key points, right? Debt is up, debt is spiraling out of control, and that's because spending is spiraling out of control. And what's the major effect of both of that happening? More money being wasted on debt interest charges. So those three numbers that you picked out, Ryan, I mean, fantastic job. You weren't even in lockup for 3 hours, but you came to the same conclusion that I did. I mean, look, let me just kind of go over a couple of those things. I mean, the government is borrowing about $80 billion this year. Like, this is nuts. This is unacceptable. Okay, it's completely unacceptable that you have a deficit around $80 billion. And now, Ryan, I mean, I'm sure you saw the parliamentary budget officer's comments in committee about a month ago, right? Well, he was saying words like unsustainable, stupefying, shocking, something is going to break. And he was talking about a deficit of $68 billion, right? That's what his report forecasts, about $10 billion less than the actual deficit this year. Now, Ryan, I'll get into spending in a second here, but I want to hone in on interest charges. Okay, $56 billion this year, more than $1 billion every week, right? That's a brand new hospital. Poof, gone every single week, because that money's going to the bond fund managers on Bay Street to pay interest charges on the Carney government's debt. Now, you're right? The government is now wasting more money paying interest on the debt than what it sends to the provinces in healthcare transfers. But let me put another little angle on it here. Okay, think about this the next time you're waiting in line at the checkout. Okay, every dollar that you are paying in federal sales tax this year is going to go to pay interest on the debt. Every dollar.
Now, let's just think about that, because the whole point of the GST in its inception, wasn't that to start paying down the debt?
Well,
wasn't that the idea?
You know what? You know what, too? And you know what actually happened in the 90s that allowed the government to balance the budget in 3 years? Massive deficit in the mid-90s, and they ended up balancing it within 3 years. They weren't able to actually balance the budget until they cut spending. And that's what always happens, right? You give them more revenue, they're just going to find new pet projects to waste your money on, right? It's never a lack of money from taxpayers that's the problem. It's always the spending problem, right? The spending is the same always, and it's always spending. And I think that's a great way to segue into this. Like, think about this. Everyone knows that the Trudeau government was a disaster when it came to out of control, reckless spending. Everyone. Right? Everyone knows. Even a Liberal MP would have to acknowledge it. I mean, they doubled the debt in a decade, right? Gross. Well, this year, Prime Minister Mark Carney, the financial guru, right? The man with the economic plan, he is going to spend $581 billion this year. That's $38 billion more than what the government spent last year. Can you believe that? Right? Spending $38 billion more than what the Trudeau government spent last year? Like what? Like for what?
Well, and this is the problem, because I listened, didn't fall asleep. I listened to Francois Philippe Champagne's speech, as long as it was. And all the sense that I kept getting is, if you don't agree with our budget, then you don't believe in Canada. That's basically what he was trying to say. And he was saying that They are going to be investing in athletic centers. I'm not sure how that's an investment. That they're going to be building hospitals. Well, don't we need doctors and nurses in order to actually fill the hospitals with staff? Because, last I checked, that was kind of a requirement. So why are we building new hospitals when we don't even have the doctors and nurses to fill them? And he kept talking about infrastructure, but he wouldn't specify as to what. So he was throwing out all these things. Now we're cutting the public servants. I guess the number is around 40,000, something like that, over the next few years. They're trying to say that's attrition. That's some pretty aggressive attrition, if you believe that. And I do know that the federal public servants, they were costing what last year? Was it $70 billion? Is that what it was last
70,
year?
70, 71. Yeah, 71 billion. Yep.
So, and we're up to 300,000 now, is it?
Oh, more than that. Yeah, more than that. I mean, even by like not even including all of them, you're above 350,000 the last I checked.
So they're cutting that, and they have this BS that they say that they're going to balance the operational budget by what, 2028. Yippity-doo. What does that matter when you're spending tens of billions of dollars more on these quote-unquote investments? And all we've been hearing from Bill Morneau and Justin Trudeau and Chrystia Freeland and everybody else is we're investing. Well, we must be the poorest investors in the history of the planet, because an investment is supposed to eventually return something to you, right? Isn't that the way it's supposed to work?
Okay, Ryan, there's a lot to unpack there. I want to go bureaucracy. I want to go operating budget. Then I want to get to this idea of investing. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the first one, and I'm going to dial in on the bureaucracy, and you hold me accountable to get to the other 2 points.
I know I'm rapid firing at you right now.
There's just a lot, and I just don't want to talk for a full hour straight. But that's me if you left me to my own devices. Okay, so on the bureaucracy, look, I don't want to be rude. I just want to look at the numbers and paint them as accurately as I can to you and your audience. So over the last 10 years, the federal government added 100,000 bureaucrats. 10 years. So, but it's not just the number of bureaucrats, it's also the cost of the bureaucracy, right? You got pay raises, bonuses, other perks that increased. So the cost of the federal bureaucracy increased 77% since 2016. 77% since 2016. Look, I'm just going to be blunt, and I'm really trying to just paint the picture. The only way to fix our finances, the only way, is to fire bureaucrats. Like, attrition isn't going to cut it. Attrition might have worked 5 to 8, 10 years ago, but it's not anymore, right? Not when you just had 100,000 over 10 years. So you got to fire bureaucrats, okay? What the Carney government is doing, it's when you say 40,000, that's like, well, maybe we'll shrink it by 40,000 by 2028. Right? If the time for 40,000 fewer bureaucrats was yesterday, right? We're way past that point. That doesn't even cut it. And that's even assuming that the government even shrinks the bureaucracy, which I think is actually a huge assumption, because here's what's happening in this budget. Okay. This is what I was able to look at during my time in lockup, is the government is claiming all of these savings. Well, 2 things about that. Number one, guess when all the savings occur? In future years, right? Isn't that something, right? The vast majority of the savings all happen in future years, right? That's like the government saying it's going to go on a diet starting Monday, but then Monday never comes. And we heard the same thing from the Trudeau government for years, right? We're going to find savings. We're going to be fiscally responsible, but it's always in the future. So I don't even think the government has really any concrete plans to fire bureaucrats, but it has to. Oh, one last thing on the spending side, Ryan, and then we can kind of get into the operating budget. But look, I said spending is $581 billion this year, $38 billion increase over last year. Every single year, the government plans to spend billions of dollars more. So pro tip for the finance minister and for Mr. Carney, when you're increasing spending by billions of dollars every single year, you're saving money wrong.
Yeah, and And this kind of comes down to what Champagne was trying to say, and we knew that Mark Carney and Champagne were going to try this spin. They're saying, "Oh, don't worry, everybody. We've restructured the way that we're going to be, doing our budget," and trying to make it seem like this is some magical new thing, and it's the cutting edge of finance. Meanwhile, an operating and a capital budget is just something that every business does every day and has for the last 100 or so years. So, um, what is your opinion on the fact that they're trying to sell this as, well, we're going to quote unquote balance the operating budget by 2028? It means nothing.
You aren't balancing squat if you're borrowing tens of billions of dollars every single year. You're not balancing anything. You're borrowing tens of billions of dollars every single year. I believe the lowest that they can get the deficit down to is like what, $57 billion in 2029. A $57 billion deficit in 2029. And if past performance is any good indicator of the future, I mean, that projection is not even worth as much as the paper it's written on, right? Like, it's not. And like, look, what the government is doing, muddying the water here, they're adding complexity to try to confuse Canadians, right? They hope that they can utter the words operate or balance the operating budget, balance the operating budget. They hope they can use that to confuse Canadians so that Canadians won't notice the debt soar. But the debt is soaring, right? The debt now is what, $1.35 trillion by the end of this year? Like, what the government is doing is not new. I mean, in fact, this is what the Trudeau government did, right? The Trudeau government tried to claim that these are investments to grow the economy. Remember, it was the Trudeau government that originally announced the billions and billions of dollars in corporate welfare to multinational corporations to build battery plants, right? This was the Trudeau line. So, folks, we've already tried this experiment. It failed, right? This idea that the government can borrow its way into prosperity is a failure. And you want proof? Look at the last 10 years. This is exactly what the Trudeau government did, right? The Trudeau government talked about fiscal responsibility that would come tomorrow, and then tomorrow never came. The Trudeau government tried to convince Canadians that it could borrow billions and billions of dollars to spur economic growth. But then inflation soared and our economy stagnated. It's the same.
Well, and that's the issue, right? You end up having to mortgage Canadians' futures over and over and over again. And it's the same old thing. And Carney seems to think, oh, well, the problem wasn't the party. The problem was that we're not spending enough. And then you look at their justification on this. Well, it's Trump and tariffs and everything. Like, well, Trump and the tariffs haven't been around the last 4 years. So what was the problem there? And then they come up with this line. I'm not sure if you heard Champagne's speech, but he ended up saying that these investments are going to bring in over $1 trillion in investment into Canada. How do you square that? Like, did they talk about that in the budget?
Yeah, and I'm gonna have a 6-pack starting tomorrow. Right? Yeah. Like as if you could just wish that into existence. Like, get real, right? I mean, look, you mentioned Trump, you mentioned the economy. So I actually want to talk about I think it's just a good jumping off point to something else in the budget, right? Because from day one, and Ryan, we talked about this on your show, right? A couple months ago about the carbon tax, how the government isn't ending carbon taxes. They just ended the visible portion of the carbon tax, right? They canceled the consumer portion of the carbon tax. Well, right in the budget is Carney's commitment to this hidden carbon tax on Canadian businesses, right? The industrial carbon tax. It's right in the budget. And like, look, regardless of who is in the White House, whether it's President Trump, whether it's another Republican, whether it's a Democrat, the U.S. national government is not bringing in a carbon tax. Okay, so what is Carney's hidden carbon tax on Canadian business going to do? Well, it's going to do two things. Number one, it's going to hammer Canada's economic competitiveness. Right, Ryan? Like, no carbon tax nationally if you go south of the border, right? So what's it going to do? Well, it's going to push Canadian entrepreneurs to cut production in Canada and set up shop south of the border. But it's also going to make life more expensive. And it's easy to think of why. Because look, a carbon tax on utilities, that makes your home heating more expensive. A carbon tax on refineries, that makes your gasoline and diesel more expensive. What does a carbon tax on fertilizer plants do? Well, that raises costs for farmers and it makes food more expensive. So, in this budget, Carney's industrial carbon taxes, hidden carbon tax on Canadian business, is the worst of all worlds. Fewer jobs for Canadians and higher prices for you.
But all we hear from the Liberals when the Conservatives are bringing up these hidden taxes is that they're imaginary. They're not there. Like Steve McKinnon must have said that word, I don't know, maybe 20 times over the last week. But if it's in his budget, how can you say that that's imaginary?
Oh, it's right there. And hey, Ryan, we've actually seen this firsthand. Both myself at committee, but another one of my colleagues from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation at committee as well, where a Liberal MP with a straight face told us they had no idea what a carbon, there is no carbon tax. What do you mean carbon tax? They weren't aware of a carbon tax in Canada. And of course, that was last year, right? And fast forward 3 months later, and they're taking social media videos of themselves, patting themselves on the back for ending the consumer carbon tax. So you see how it is?
It's gross is what it is. And one of the things that we get questions on, because I think a lot of Canadians were very nervous about this day, and a lot of young people were nervous about this day because Mark Carney was telling everybody that everyone better be ready to sacrifice. And never mind the contradiction that he says we're going to do things at speeds that haven't been seen before. But then in the very next breath, he said, but this is going to take time. So what are the prospects for young people in this country when they see a budget like this? Should they be hopeful? Should they be worried? Because these are the questions that Canadians are asking.
Yeah, that's great. I heard Carney, I believe it was Carney, maybe it was the finance minister, also referred to this as a generational budget.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing generational about this budget is that it's going to be future generations paying back this debt for the rest of their lives, right? And look, a baby born today, she is crying because she's already on the hook for $32,000 in federal government debt, right? And look, I truly believe that all Canadians, they do want to leave their kids, their grandkids with a better financial future than what they had. But the federal government is saddling not just today's Canadians, it impacts us today, but it's also saddling your kids, your grandkids with this mountain of debt to pay back. And, I'll go back into that point that you brought up with sacrifice. Ryan, this drives me nuts. Sacrifice. Who's sacrificing, right? Yeah, Canadians today are sacrificing massive amount of taxes, all levels of government. It's almost half your family's budget for the average family going to taxes. So today's Canadians are suffering. Canadians tomorrow are going to suffer, the kids, the grandkids, because of all this debt. When is it time for government to suffer, right? When are members of parliament going to share in the tough times? Ever? Right? Since the beginning of 2020, all members of parliament from all parties have taken 6 pay raises since the beginning of 2020. And Ryan, I'll say this too, because, we go after, obviously, the government of the day quite hard because they're the ones at the end of the day who make the decisions. But I haven't heard a single member of parliament from a single party, including the official opposition, forcefully speak out against the MP pay raises. I haven't heard it. And we both know that they could really make a stink out of an issue if they put their mind to it, right? We all know that can happen. Look at the carbon tax. But look, it's this more than just leadership at the top, which I think matters. But, the reason you need members of parliament to tighten their belts is because that gives them the moral authority to push for real savings in the bureaucracy. And this isn't hypothetical, okay? Before the 2023 strike, right, the Peace Act strike, those union bosses pointed to the annual MP pay raises that they give themselves as a reason why the bureaucracy should take more money from taxpayers. Or even if you go throughout, through recent history in Canada, okay, you look at the Harper era. It went from the 0809 recession, and they started to bring our books back in resembling fiscal sanity. Well, they stopped the pay raises under the Harper government. They reformed the pensions in the early 90s. They cut minister and prime minister's pay. You look at Alberta, right? Like where I moved from, the Klein government. Remember when Klein held up that paid in full sign in 2004 to signal a debt-free Alberta? It all started with the politicians taking a pay cut.
Yeah, because you have to lead by example. You and even Champagne said, "Well, we have to get our house in order. If we're asking." I remember when I started working for the government, and I said to my wife, I said, "This is crazy," and she said, "What?" I said, "Canadians are actually having a lot of trouble around the country, but it's like there's this bubble around the government, and nobody understands it, nobody gets it, because you always need to pay for government." So nobody really worried about their jobs. Nobody really worried about their cuts. We saw companies around the country downsizing over the last few years. Government kept hiring people, and it didn't matter. And it was another world. It was almost like you were in another country. How they were operating. So to that point, um, you have to start at the top, and that's called leadership, and that's called sacrifice, because this is where I think Carney's words really missed the mark, and even mainstream media was reporting that they missed the mark. Because how do you sit there making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year and have a multi-million-dollar pension waiting for you at the end of your tenure?
Prime Minister gets two.
Right. And look Canadians in the face and saying, well, it's going to be tough, everybody, but we need to sacrifice.
It's gross.
I don't know how they say that with a straight face.
And Ryan, what I think the pandemic really put a light on was this tale of two Canadas, right? Because look, we saw this where the private sector took it on the chin, right? Thousands of Canadians outside of government sent to the ranks of the unemployed. But it was a lot of financial gain for bureaucrats within government, right? The golden gates of government, pay raises, bonuses. And look, I remember I moved to Ottawa from Calgary around 2021. Yeah, it was 2021. And I remember one of the stories that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation put out was how the government was handing out pay raises and bonuses, millions of dollars during the pandemic when Canadians were struggling, right? And that story got a lot of pickup, as it should have. Canadians deserve to know that. Well, I went to a party. One of my friends was having a party and I was there. And some lady came up to me and she said, "Franco, you just don't get it. Us bureaucrats work hard. We deserve the bonuses." Even during the pandemic, Ryan. This was during a pandemic when the private sector took it on the chin. This lady was going on about how government bureaucrats just work so hard and they deserve the bonuses on top of the pay raises, on top of the job security.
You know who deserved bonuses during the pandemic? And maybe this is me having some personal bias. IT folks deserved bonuses during the pandemic because they were expected to move mountains and create magic out of nothing to allow all these companies that would never pay for security and remote technology prior to the pandemic, and then all of a sudden snap their fingers and wanted it right then and there. Never mind all of the tens of thousands of laptops that had to be procured because companies didn't believe in laptops, didn't believe in working from home. Well, now everybody's working from home. IT make it happen. There was a lot of late nights for a lot of IT people across this country. But anyway, that's just
except for the ArriveCan government executives. They did not deserve bonuses, folks. I gotta say this.
Well, they were IT people, so there you go.
Yeah, no, you're right. So, folks, like everyone remembers ArriveCan, right? A simple app, a launch for $80,000. You had these two independent techies who recreated it over the span of a long weekend. I think it was Thanksgiving long weekend. So, anyways, this app launches. Right, initial price tag $80,000. The final tab is like $60 million somehow, right? And then the government executives working on ArriveCan took home $340,000 in bonuses. Like what? A debacle, pure failure. And yet the government, government executives, they pat themselves on the back, they rubber stamp themselves some bonuses.
Okay, so let me ask you a straight question. They've claimed that this budget is going to spur tons of investment into Canada. Based on what you've seen, is that accurate or is that complete spin?
Well, was it Einstein who talked about the definition of insanity? Right? Insanity,
Probably.
right? Right? Doing the same thing and expecting different results. Look, we have already tried this failed experiment. This is a continuation of the Trudeau era. More government borrowing, right? Saying that more government is going to lead to prosperity. We've just tried this. We just had 10 years of this, where even before the pandemic, the government was spending all-time highs, right? Like, the government is not the solution to our woes. The government has become the problem, right? We have just lived through a decade of government waste, more government regulations, higher taxes. We need the exact opposite. We need Ottawa to get out of the way, right? Look, Canada can and should be the freest, most prosperous place in the world, right? We have the people here to do it. We have the abundant and diverse natural resources all across Canada. All we need is for Ottawa to get out of the way. Let entrepreneurs build. Let people start their own companies, right? Let that, new graduate from Waterloo to start that next Google or Amazon. Stop punishing success. Stop punishing people who are trying to put food on their table or trying to grow a business or trying to save for the retirement so they can pass down, some inheritance to their family. But, high income taxes, high business taxes, onerous regulations, that is punishing Canada's economy. There is no reason that Canada isn't, the most prosperous free place in the world, other than the fact that Ottawa is just meddling in all of the economy.
So Canadians should be writing lots of letters, I think, over the next couple of days to their member of parliament and to any other member of parliament that they wish to. What would you say that their main message should be?
Well, first, I have a main message for Canadians, right? Don't feel pessimistic where you just say, enough is enough, and I don't want to get involved. You have to stay involved, and a little bit of optimism. Like, there was these massive deficits in the 90s, right? Everyone talks about the 95 budget that eventually, 3 years down the road, led to a surplus. Well, we forget to talk about the 1994 budget, right? The 1994 budget was not full of all these spending cuts, right? And it was pressure from Canadians, some economic external pressure that forced the government to finally cut spending, to finally do the right thing, and to actually balance the budget. So folks, don't let this pessimism just force you to stop or to not be engaged. We have to stay active, especially right now. Like, look, these politicians are trying to sell the budget. Tell them, no, you ain't buying what they're selling, and that enough is enough. Yes, cut spending. Yes, balance the budget. Stop racking up debt. Look, the time is now. Don't get discouraged. We have to keep up the pressure.
And the other thing that I would encourage Canadians to include in that is, it's not just a matter of cutting spending. We also need to cut our legislation as well, that is getting in the way of unlocking the potential of this country. Because I agree, we are literally sitting on a gold mine, and we're like John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, just looking around, trying to figure out where we are. Get the legislation out of the way, cut the spending, allow private enterprise to come in and exploit the country for its riches. Then you get additional revenue and government taxes because of that. People get high paying jobs, and we become one of the richest countries in the world.
Here, Ottawa, get out of the way.